There is a sealed envelope in the Smithsonian American History Museum, Exhibit Hall 7, between the Watergate tapes and the Vietnam draft lottery capsules. It sits in a climate-controlled case under soft light. The handwriting on the front is precise. It reads, "To be opened upon my death, SK." That envelope was opened on March 7th, 1981, and its contents destroyed a presidency, dismantled a federal agency, and shattered the most celebrated achievement in American history. Every schoolchild knows what it said, but how America arrived at that envelope, how the lie was built, how it held, and how it finally broke, is a story that still defines the country 60 years later. In May 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. At that point, the total American experience in human spaceflight amounted to 15 minutes. Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, a brief arc above the atmosphere and back down, was all NASA had accomplished. The Soviets, meanwhile, had already put Yuri Gagarin into full orbit. First satellite, first animal in space, first human in space, first spacewalk. By every measure, the Soviet Union was winning the space race. Decisively. Kennedy's promise was not about science, it was about geopolitics. If the Soviet Union controlled space, it controlled the narrative of the future. Proof that communism could out-engineer, out-innovate, and out-achieve the capitalist West. The moon was a symbol, and in the Cold War, symbols were worth more than physics. So NASA received what amounted to a blank check, and 400,000 Americans were put to work on the Apollo program. 4% of the entire federal budget flowed into this effort. It was the largest peacetime mobilization in American history. And then, in January of 1967, everything fell apart. A routine test on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, sealed inside a command module for a systems check. A spark ignited the pure oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule. All 3 men were dead in 17 seconds. The congressional investigations that followed consumed over a year. NASA's timeline, already aggressive, collapsed. Redesigns, reviews, delays. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued their own lunar program, and the calendar kept turning. By 1968, the new president, Richard Nixon, was staring at Kennedy's deadlines with less than 2 years remaining and a space program that was behind schedule, over budget, and reeling from disaster. It was in this atmosphere of institutional panic that someone asked the question that would change the course of history. What if America didn't actually have to go? In April of 1968, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey premiered in Washington, D.C. The film was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The spacecraft looked real. The zero-gravity sequences were physically convincing. The lunar surface was so detailed, so immersive, that audiences genuinely struggled to distinguish Kubrick's fiction from documentary footage. Someone in the Nixon administration saw the film and had a very dangerous idea. The details of what happened next remained classified for decades. What the declassified records now shows is this. In late 1968, a small team from the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence visited Kubrick at his estate in England. They explained the situation. They appealed to his patriotism. They offered unlimited resources, complete creative control, and something Kubrick valued more than money: the chance to create something no filmmaker had ever attempted. Kubrick agreed. The production that followed was the most technically ambitious filmmaking operation in history, and it had to be invisible. Kubrick's first problem was gravity. The moon has 1/6 Earth's gravitational pull. Astronauts on the lunar surface would move in ways impossible to replicate with wires or harnesses. Kubrick's solution: film everything in slow motion and play it back at normal speed. At 1969 broadcast resolution, grainy, compressed, transmitted through hundreds of thousands of miles of simulated static, the effect was convincing enough. The second problem was lighting. The moon has no atmosphere, no diffused light. Every shadow on the lunar surface should be razor sharp, parallel, and absolutely black. Studio lighting produces the opposite: soft shadows from multiple sources. Kubrick had to engineer massive collimated light arrays that mimicked a single distant light source. He had to make his lighting look less professional to match what the moon would actually produce. And the third problem was the surface itself. Kubrick's team constructed a soundstage the size of 3 football fields in a restricted area of the Nevada test site. They covered it with tons of volcanic ash to simulate lunar regolith. Sections of the set were vacuum sealed to eliminate airborne dust particles. Because on the moon, with no atmosphere, dust doesn't float. The fourth problem, and the most dangerous, was the Soviet Union. Soviet tracking stations monitored every NASA transmission. If Apollo 11 never left Earth's orbit, Soviet analysts would know within hours. The radio signals wouldn't carry the right delay. The trajectory data wouldn't match. So the mission had to actually launch. On July 16th, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in front of 100,000 spectators. The Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly. The spacecraft reached Earth orbit, and then it did not go to the moon. Instead, Apollo 11 entered a carefully calculated elliptical orbit designed to remain consistent with Soviet tracking expectations during the critical lunar transit phase. The real spacecraft stayed in Earth orbit, while on a soundstage in Nevada, Kubrick rolled the cameras. The astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, were in the spacecraft for the duration, maintaining the radio communications that Soviet global tracking stations would monitor. The lunar surface footage was transmitted to NASA's Mission Control in Houston, which broadcasted to the world with the appropriate 1.3-second signal delay. 600 million people watched the broadcast on July 20th, 1969. They saw Armstrong descend the ladder. They heard the words,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
None of it was real. The Soviets were suspicious. Their tracking data was inconclusive. Not definitively wrong, but not definitively right either. But exposing the fraud would mean admitting they had lost the space race to a film set, and that their own tracking capabilities had failed to detect the deception. So Moscow chose to stay silent. The lie held. For decades, the psychological deterioration of the Apollo 11 crew was attributed to the pressures of fame, the disorientation of post-mission life, and the ordinary struggles of men who had experienced something extraordinary. The declassified documents tell a very different story. In 2019, a tranche of previously sealed CIA files was released under a mandatory declassification review. Among them were records from a subprogram of MKUltra, the CIA's notorious mind control program, which was designated internally as Apollo Subset. The documents reveal that Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins were subjected to a series of conditioning protocols in the months before the mission. The program's stated objective was to ensure psychological compliance, suppress guilt responses, and create what the files described as durable cognitive partitioning. The ability to maintain a false narrative under sustained public scrutiny without psychological collapse. Armstrong received the most intensive treatment. The protocols included pharmacological intervention, sleep deprivation conditioning, and what the documents described as narrative integration therapy, a process designed to blur the subject's own memory of events, making the false version feel increasingly real over time. Collins received a lighter version of the same program. Aldrin received nothing. Buzz Aldrin was not a subject of the MKUltra protocols. He was a participant in them. The declassified files identify Aldrin as a CIA asset recruited before his selection for the Apollo program. His role was operational: monitor the psychological state of Armstrong and Collins during the mission, report any signs of non-compliance or breakdown, and if necessary intervene to maintain the integrity of the operation. Aldrin was, in intelligence terminology, a handler. This reframes everything that followed. Armstrong's famous reclusiveness, his refusal to give interviews, his inability to capitalize on his fame, his near total withdrawal from public life was not simply the preference of a private man. According to the declassified files, it was a predictable side effect of the conditioning. The cognitive partitioning eroded over time, leaving Armstrong increasingly unable to reconcile what he knew had happened with what the world believed had happened. Collins maintained a more stable public persona, but those close to him noted persistent emotional distance. In a 1974 interview, he made a remark about the weight of what we carried, that at the time was interpreted as a poetic reference to the moon rocks. And then there was Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin's descent into alcoholism and severe depression in the 1970s is one of the most well-documented personal collapses in American public life. He lost his marriage, he lost his career, he drifted through odd jobs and psychiatric treatments for years. The standard explanation has always been that the moon landing was the peak of his life, and that nothing after could compare. That he was a man destroyed by the impossibility of following the greatest achievement in human history. But Aldrin didn't walk on the moon. What destroyed Buzz Aldrin was not the impossibility of surpassing greatness, it was guilt. He had been the handler. He had watched Armstrong and Collins be chemically and psychologically manipulated to ensure their compliance. He had monitored their mental states and reported back to CIA contacts, and he had carried the full, unmedicated, unpartitioned weight of the truth for the rest of his life. Armstrong's mind was altered to help him forget. Collins was buffered. Aldrin was left with all of it, clear-eyed, full aware, and completely alone with the knowledge of what he had done. The famous 2002 incident in which an elderly Aldrin punched a conspiracy theorist who confronted him about the moon landing takes on a different meaning in this context. It was not the righteous anger of a hero defending his legacy, it was the volcanic rage of a man who had spent 33 years carrying a secret that was consuming him from the inside, being confronted by someone who had stumbled onto the truth without understanding what any of it had cost. The physical evidence began to fail almost immediately. NASA had distributed lunar samples, 842 pounds of rock allegedly collected from the moon's surface, to research institutions worldwide. These samples were supposed to be 4.5 billion years old, formed in conditions unique to the lunar environment. No atmosphere, no water, constant micrometeorite bombardment. Manufacturing convincing fakes was, it turns out, significantly harder than anyone had anticipated. By 1971, a researcher in West Germany identified anomalies in the crystalline structure of the sample. The isotope ratios were fractionally wrong, close, but not close enough to survive rigorous analysis. The paper was published in a minor journal and largely ignored. By 1973, 3 additional research teams had identified similar discrepancies. Whispers began circulating in the geoscience community. NASA responded with increasingly aggressive pushback, clarifying several follow-up studies and pressuring journal editors to reject papers questioning the sample's authenticity. And then came Watergate, June 1972. The break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, the tapes, the cover-ups, the lies. When Nixon resigned in August of 1974, the immediate crisis was political, but the deeper damage was epidemic. If the President of the United States had lied systematically about Watergate and maintained the lie under oath and been caught, what else had he lied about? The question that once seemed insane, did America actually go to the moon, suddenly didn't seem insane at all. The collapse began with a single defector. In 1976, a mid-level NASA engineer named Harold Kessler walked into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City carrying documents, flight plans, telemetry data, and internal communications proving that Apollo 11 never left orbit. Kessler was bitter, passed over for promotion, divorced, struggling with alcohol. He had known the truth for 7 years, and it had almost eaten him alive. The Soviets spent months verifying the documents against their own 1969 tracking data. When they confirmed the material was authentic, they faced a strategic choice: expose the fraud publicly and humiliate America on the world stage, or hold the information as political leverage, blackmail on a civilizational scale. They chose leverage for a while. But intelligence secrets have half-lives, and by 1978, rumors circulated through intelligence communities worldwide. A French newspaper published a cryptic report about unresolved questions surrounding the Apollo program. A British documentary raised technical doubts that mainstream media had previously dismissed. Then, on March 7th, 1981, Stanley Kubrick died of a heart attack at his home in England. Among his personal effects, his widow, Christine, found a sealed envelope with instructions that it be opened upon his death. Inside was a handwritten confession, detailed, precise, and comprehensive. Every name, every date, every technical detail of the production, the location of the soundstage, the chain of command from the CIA to the Oval Office. She contacted an attorney. The attorney contacted the FBI. The FBI contacted the White House. President Reagan chose suppression. It didn't hold. In 1983, the confession leaked. The story broke on a Sunday morning, and by Monday, it was the only thing anyone on Earth was talking about. The aftermath was catastrophic. American institutional credibility, already damaged by Vietnam, Watergate, and the Church Committee revelations about CIA misconduct, collapsed entirely. If the government had lied about the moon landing, what else had it fabricated? The question consumed American public discourse for years. Trust in federal institutions fell to levels not recorded before or since. Internationally, the damage was worse. The Soviet Union declared ideological victory. NATO fractured as European allies questioned the fundamental honesty of their senior partner. The special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom went cold overnight, and NASA was dismantled. The space shuttle program, already in development, was cancelled. Congressional funding for space exploration dropped to effectively zero. And by 1990, the United States had no human spaceflight capabilities whatsoever. The moon remains untouched. No human being has ever walked on its surface. The footprints that should have been preserved forever in the lunar dust simply do not exist. And the MK Ultra revelations, when they emerged in the 2019 declassification, added a final, sickening layer to the scandal. The American government had not merely lied to the world, it had chemically and psychologically manipulated its own astronauts, its own heroes, to maintain a lie. Armstrong and Collins were not co-conspirators, they were victims. Only Aldrin knew everything, and by the time the documents were released, he had spent 50 years being destroyed by it. The Apollo hoax is now 60 years old. It has been studied, litigated, documented, and debated more than any other event in American history. Entire academic departments exist to analyze its cultural impact. The Smithsonian exhibits draw 3 million visitors a year. And yet, the most unsettling detail in the entire affair is not the lie itself, but how close it came to never being exposed at all. If Kubrick had not written the confession and not died at a young age, if Kessler had not walked into that embassy, if the moon rock researchers had been slightly less rigorous, if Aldrin had been conditioned along with the others instead of being left to carry the truth alone, the operation was designed to be permanent. It was designed so that no single point of failure could bring it down. It took 3: a filmmaker's guilt, a scientist's precision, and a broken man in a rumpled suit with a briefcase and nothing left to lose. History is full of lies that held. This one didn't, but only barely. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next Signal 33.
But who cares? White Truth Right is about a future movie or something coming out, or
No.
Okay.
It's not about any movie. It's not about the movies I've made in the past. It's a confession of sorts.
Okay. I mean, about you cheated on your wife, you plagiarized.
I would never do that. No.
Plagiarized something.
It's about a movie I made that nobody is aware of, even though they've seen it.
Okay.
Is that intriguing? Do I have you intrigued?
Well, I mean, see if I understand what you said. It's about a movie you made, no one knows you made. Is that what you said?
That's right. It's a production.
Like, some of you put, like, you didn't put your name on it? Like, at the end, you put, like, a fake name?
Oh, no. I made it.
Like Alan Smithy, like that
That's
type
right.
of thing?
No, I didn't. There was no name put on it.
Why? Why would there be no credits? What do you mean?
Because there are some things that you just can't put your name on.
Okay.
I perpetrated a huge fraud, which I am now about to detail,
Okay.
involving the United States government and NASA.
All right.
And I'm sure you've heard the rumors.
The moon landing hoax?
That's right. That the moon landing was fake. The moon landings all were fake. And I was the person who filmed it.
You're serious okay.
I am serious. I'm dead serious.
Because I only have this certain amount of time with you, and I'll talk about whatever you want. This isn't some type of joke or
No, it's not
film within a film thing.
Not a joke. Nope.
Okay.
The conspiracy theorists were right on this occasion.
Why?
I don't know about Paul McCartney's death, but this they were right about.
Okay. Why in God's name I don't know what to ask you first. Why the hell, if you're telling the truth, why would you do it? Why are you telling me? I mean, what the?
Don't you think it's important for people to know the truth?
Yeah, yes, certainly.
They had a massive fraud, an unparalleled fraud perpetrated against them. They should know.
Okay.
I mean, they're already suspicious of the government. They may as well have their suspicions confirmed.
Okay.
And justified.
And why now? I mean, we're almost at the 30-year anniversary. What took so long? Why, if this is true, why?
I'll go into that. It has to do with personal
okay.
Evolution and influences.
And,
I'll go into that.
Is that why you look a little haggard right now? Because you look a little worn, no offense.
Well, also, yeah, because I haven't been taking care of myself too well. I've been drinking a lot, but...
Is that because of the stress of this?
Of course. Stress, guilt, just conflict of all kinds.
Wow. I mean, so you feel bad about this, clearly. I mean, this is not...
I do feel bad about it. I also feel proud of it. It's a terrible conflict.
Because you've pulled off one of the greatest hoaxes ever because of your...
And because I made a film, if you want to call it a film, which I consider to be my masterpiece.
And you can't take credit or even talk about it
Well,
you are now.
I'm hereby taking credit.
Right, but you can't actually go out. You're doing when people see this, you'll be dead.
Until 10 years.
Right, or 15, yeah.
After my death.
So you can't talk to Roger Ebert about it. Does that frustrate you?
I have to pay the consequences for the decision that I made many years ago to go along with this.
Like a deal with the devil.
It's Faustian, to be sure.
And is that why you got such power in Hollywood? I mean, that would explain that.
Why I have the freedom I have, that was part of it, yes.
So they said, do this moon thing and we'll give you...
When I made Spartacus, I didn't have this kind of freedom.
Right.
But I have it now.
So what came first, the genius or the fraud?
What was NASA's doing?
Well, what came first, the genius or the fraud? I mean, did the fraud enable the genius, or was the genius released by the fraud?
I'd like to think the genius came first.
Right.
But some frauds are hard to bypass, especially if you have an ego and you're an artist and you're presented with a challenge, the likes of which you've never seen